I have a book in the background because this video is about books, and this is the only book that I own. The other day I was walking through the beautiful city of Chicago, Illinois, when I came across something that really surprised me. I saw a Barnes & Noble. Yes, that Barnes & Noble, the once prominent US bookstore that disappeared because of Amazon, and let's be honest, everyone has a Nintendo Switch now, so why would you read a book? My childhood Barnes & Noble in Maryland shut down and became a women's clothing store. So that's when I thought that Barnes & Noble was pretty much dead. That was the nail in the coffin. So imagine my surprise when I realized that that Barnes & Noble had been there for a year in Chicago. And then I was in another neighborhood and there was another Barnes & Noble that had also been there for a year. So that's when I realized Barnes & Noble is still growing and adding stores when I thought they had gone out of business long ago. This was kind of an insane revelation to me, so naturally I had to look into it. Barnes & Noble's roots go all the way back to 1873, when Charles M. Barnes started a book business in Wheaton, Illinois. Fast forward to 1917, his son William moved to New York and teamed up with G. Clifford Noble to open what would eventually become the flagship Barnes & Noble store in Manhattan. Then, in 1971, Leonard Riggio bought the flagship store and the name. He turned it into the world's largest bookstore and started expanding across the country with a new idea: the Superstore. These weren't just bookstores. They sold music, educational toys, games, and gifts. Barnes & Noble went public and grew like crazy in the 90s and 2000s. In 2001, they purchased SparkNotes. Yes, that's SparkNotes, the study aid that we all used in school as a way to actually avoid purchasing and reading the actual book. Okay, don't act like you didn't do that. During Barnes & Noble's growth phase, they kind of developed a reputation of being the big box bully. They would come into town and put all the independent bookstores out of business. In fact, in 1998, Barnes & Noble and Borders were actually sued by the American Booksellers Association and a group of independent bookstores for allegedly using their market power to demand unfair discounts from publishers. The case was eventually settled out of court, and of course, Barnes & Noble claimed victory. Barnes & Noble was really putting pressure on independent booksellers. In fact, in the 8 years leading up to the 2008 recession, over 1,000 independent bookstores went out of business according to the New Republic. Meanwhile, Barnes & Noble was absolutely thriving, with at their peak in 2008, they had 726 stores. But while Barnes & Noble was winning the war against independent bookstores, there was a new competitor slowly creeping up on them: Amazon. You may have heard of it. In just 2 years of launching in 1995, Amazon.com was already pulling in $110 million a year in book sales. And when it went public in 1997, it was valued at around $670 million. Barnes & Noble, noticing the threat of online shopping, actually opened up their own website called barnesandnoble.com. A really creative name, I know. And to compete with Amazon, they offered discounts up to 30%, which caused Amazon to have to try and match that, and these two companies were at war. In 2009, Barnes & Noble released the Nook. It was an e-reader that was meant to rival Amazon's Kindle, which was released a couple years prior. Despite initial success, the Nook ultimately backfired big time. By 2017, Nook's market share had dropped to just 2.1%, compared to Amazon Kindle's 84%. And by 2013, Barnes & Noble had lost $1 billion on the project. The Nook was kind of a failure. I remember going to Barnes & Noble as a kid and looking at the Nook section, and it was always kind of empty. And even as like a little Eric, I always thought it was kind of weird that Barnes & Noble tried to do the Nook, because I never really heard about the Nook outside of it, like inside the stores. My parents had the Kindles, which were just a much better user experience and were just way better at adapting with the times and adding new features, and it just seemed like the Nook didn't have the same capabilities. The Nook was just one of the many problems that Barnes & Noble began to have. From 2008 to 2018, the company closed around 150 stores. In 2018 alone, it laid off 1,800 full-time employees, and the stock fell 55% from the previous year. The company was in absolute turmoil. It went through 4 CEOs in 5 years, and it was clear that there was some change that was needed to keep Barnes & Noble alive. In 2019, Barnes & Noble was acquired by Elliott Management for the price of its inventory, which wasn't a lot of money. Elliott Management appointed James Daunt, who had previously run his own independent bookstores and then also was credited with turning around Waterstones, which was a British bookstore chain thing. I can't think. or talk or do anything right, apparently. James Daunt brought a new vision to the bookstore. One of Daunt's biggest contributions was changing how the bookstores were run. Before Daunt took over, every Barnes & Noble looked the same. The layout, the inventory, even the placement of books, it was all dictated by corporate offices. Employees had to follow strict instructions on where to put specific titles, and in some cases, even how they angled the tables was dictated by corporate. Barnes & Noble was originally meant to be a place where you go in for the book, ask an associate where the book is, find it, and then leave. Daunt wanted to throw away the corporate playbook completely. With his background in independent bookstores, he wanted to run each bookstore like an independent bookstore. He wanted to completely decentralize the Barnes & Noble name. If you went into one Barnes & Noble in Chicago, the one in LA should be completely different. He left the curation of the stores completely up to the teams, where staff could show their recommended picks and arrange the books however they liked. They could even order their own stock and even sell it at their own prices. The stores also went through a major design overhaul, with smaller tables letting the books shine, brighter lighting getting rid of the previous darker aesthetic of the previous stores, and lighter wood for the shelves. Daunt wanted to create a bookstore where people could wander in and explore around, similar to that of an independent bookstore. Daunt got rid of Barnes & Noble's previous pay-to-play model, where publishers could actually pay to have certain books featured at the center of the store. Despite this actually being a good revenue source for Barnes & Noble, it created an inauthentic experience where they were promoting books that weren't really the best that they had to offer. While Barnes & Noble was shifting their strategy, they also noticed the emergence of BookTok, which is basically a community on TikTok where a bunch of the younger generation talks about books. Leaning into this, Barnes & Noble actually created tables specifically for BookTok, where people could see the books that everyone was talking about on TikTok, as well as other books that might be kind of similar to that they would also enjoy. I have to point out the irony of people using TikTok as a way to discover books and actually read, because it's TikTok. It kind of like destroys your brain. I kind of imagine these Zoomers like reading books, but then having like Subway Surfers in the background to like retain their attention. But Barnes & Noble is slowly becoming a third space for kids and young adults, where they can come after work or school and just walk around, sip coffee, and hang out with each other. Personally, as a guy in my mid-20s, I've been looking for a nice third space for a really long time. I don't really like libraries because they're too quiet, and I don't really like bars because I don't like staying up super late and everyone's really loud and there's a bunch of frat bros. And I don't know why I keep going on about this, because this video is not about that. It's about Barnes & Noble. But the younger generation is actually going to Barnes & Noble and walking around and meeting new people. And I think that's pretty cool. Wouldn't you think that's... I mean, I think that's cool personally. I don't know. Now, one thing you're probably wondering is, okay, but Amazon still exists, so how is Amazon affecting Barnes & Noble? And in James Daunt's interviews, he kind of looks at it in a pretty diplomatic way and saying that Amazon is actually making Barnes & Noble better. Because Amazon stocks these boring and informational books, people can just go to Amazon for that, while Barnes & Noble, they can have the inventory for much better books that people will actually enjoy reading. Previously, a lot of Barnes & Nobles used to be absolutely ginormous, meaning they had some books that were just kind of like lame, that just sit in the back that no one really went to. And now that they're smaller, and then they can curate, is English even my first language? And now that they are smaller and they can curate these things, they can have a much better selection for people. One issue with Amazon is that there's not really good discoverability. You can't really find new books or recommendations like you would in a bookstore. You can go to a bookstore, walk around, and you can ask the booksellers if they have any recommendations. The tables are curated where they have books that are similar to other books that are there. In Amazon, it's very like, okay, I'm coming here for this book, I'm gonna buy this book, and it's gonna get here in under a day, and that's that. I don't know if you've ever been on Amazon, but there's always like these promoted products that they push towards the top because people are actually paying for that placement. So that might not actually be the best book. It's just who's ever paying the most amount of money. And also, I think there really is something to be said about people just going in person to pick up a book for whatever reason that is more meaningful to some people than just buying it online. You actually get to feel the book and, you know, kind of skim through it. I don't know. I personally don't really get it, but I know there are some people that really do value that over buying it online. This year, Barnes & Noble is set to open 60 stores, and last year they opened around 60 stores as well, so they're in a growth phase right now. I am curious to see how long this trajectory will last. Will they keep opening new stores? I really don't know. Almost every article and interview that I watched or read for this video was praising Barnes & Noble and James Daunt's new strategy, and I really do think James Daunt is a very likable CEO. Everything I saw from him looked really good. He has a background in independent book selling, and he's clearly very passionate about it and knowledgeable, and I do think it's admirable to, as a CEO, realize that you're not like the main guy and let like the people in the stores actually make the decisions. Like, I think that's pretty cool, and ultimately it seems to be paying off. However, I really wanted to make sure I wasn't falling for this corporate propaganda, because I was thinking in the back of my mind, okay, well, what about the independent bookstores? And that remains to be seen how that's gonna kind of play out with Barnes & Noble and other bookstores. Hopefully they can kind of all coexist together, but I really need to see more before, I kind of make my judgment on that. Daunt himself has said in interviews that he wouldn't want to open a location that would actually go on top of an independent bookstore or put another bookstore out of business. And that's all great, but like I said, I really want to see that in action and see how that plays out. But I'll admit, after everything I was hearing and reading about Barnes & Noble, I caught myself buying into the hype. So I was like, okay, I need to investigate this in person. I need to do some boots on the ground journalism and really see if Barnes & Noble is all that it's cracked up to be. So I went to the Barnes & Noble in Lincoln Park. No, not that Lincoln Park. And I went to walk around. The store itself wasn't very huge. It's definitely a lot smaller than the ones I remember as a kid. But keep in mind, I was in the suburbs of DC growing up, so there was a lot more space for Barnes & Nobles. Like, these things were giant. This one was really tiny. It really felt like every part of the store had a purpose. Yes, there was a section for toys and Legos, but they weren't really that big. There was a vinyl section, but it was kind of a limited selection. A lot of the focus was really on the books overall. There was a local author signing as soon as I walked in, and I immediately noticed the curated sections complete with handwritten notes about staff picks and recommendations. I also liked the way the books were displayed. It felt somewhat personal for the most part. And to prove that Daunt is actually leaving the curation up to the staff, I actually overheard some of them talking about how they were going to curate certain things. One employee was like, okay, I think it's time to get rid of this book at the front because it doesn't have its moment anymore. Its moment is over and we need to replace it with this other book. And then the other guy was like, well, actually, let's leave it, till Father's Day, and they kind of went back and forth. But it was really a collaborative process. Additionally, I overheard staff talking about how they wanted this book to go into the LGBT section because they thought it was a really good book and that they thought it would be a good kind of centerpiece or whatever. It felt very thoughtful, and it felt like all these people really cared about books and how they were displayed, and that was kind of cool to see. I will say one interesting thing that I noticed was when they were moving the tables around, they were very particular about like how many inches apart they were. Like, there was this guy and he was like, okay, now move it like 1 inch that way, and okay, no, like another inch. And I don't know how normal that is. I know that was previously like a big thing with like the previous Barnes & Noble ownership, is that they were very particular about this stuff. I think maybe that manager, that's just, something they're passionate about or they think makes a difference. I don't know. I never really worked in retail, so I don't know. But that was kind of interesting and amusing to see. The one letdown that I had was that there was no cafe. Now, that this could be this particular location. Like I said, it's in Chicago. It's not super big, so there wasn't really room for a cafe. Also, there was like maybe one chair to sit in. I remember the appeal of Barnes & Noble kind of growing up was that it was kind of a place where you could go and kind of browse around, but you could also get work done as well. Like, you could bring a laptop, you could sit at the cafe, you could do some work, and there's really no opportunity for that here, making this kind of harder to be an actual proper third space because there's really nowhere to sit or like an outlet to plug your laptop in or anything like that. This was mainly focused on just like the books and walking around, which is fine. I'm sure there's other locations that are much better at that, but that was just one letdown for me personally. Ultimately, I really enjoyed walking around and kind of exploring. Just the way everything was set up made it a really fun experience for me. I also almost did purchase a book. There was one that was sitting there that I actually really thought about buying, and then funny enough, I actually went to Amazon and saw that I could get it for literally half of what Barnes & Noble was asking for. So they might have a problem there. So right now, as far as I can see, Barnes & Noble is growing, and Jeff Bezos doesn't seem to be a huge issue for them at the moment. but time will only tell to see how this goes. But it is really interesting to kind of see how just the very simple idea of letting staff just pick how the store is arranged and what books are on display made a huge difference. I don't know if that's like kind of the only driving factor, but that certainly seems to be a pretty big factor in everything. And I don't know, I just found that really interesting. Now you're probably wondering, is this guy that hasn't read a book since graduating college going to start reading again thanks to Barnes & Noble? And the answer to that is no. Probably not. Nope. Okay. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And I will see you in the next video.